As you can see, there is a lot of racial inequity embedded in the educational system. But here at the Culture Co-op, it's our goal to promote respect for equity, cultural competency, diversity, literacy, and a quality education for all. We really are working with schools and systems to try to get them to look at the whole educational system holistically and against the backdrop of historical practices, policies, constructs that have created what we're seeing, the mass inequity that we're seeing in schools, which is failing the bulk of our students. Here at the Culture Co-op, we partner with school districts and organizations to help them look at their practices, policies, and constructs, and to examine what kinds of things that they are doing to perpetuate the very things that we're trying to work against that are sabotaging students being successful as well as the teachers. We explore things like culturally relevant education as well as social emotional learning, but in a context, trying to get schools to see that unless they address the satiation of these systems that created all these inequity in institutions, that their interventions will only be successful to a limited degree. So we have a paradigm for transformation that we do, and we go all over the country, and our work goes beyond to make sure students in schools are exposed to best practices. Like, for example, we know that teacher training is critical, that actually is in the top 3, number 1 by some research, of predicting the success of a student. We also make sure that we work with a cohort of experts who have a variety of information that's useful to hit the parents, to hit the teachers, to hit the students themselves, and organizations and businesses in the community, which can make a difference. We need your help, though. We need you to partner with us, to support us, to make a donation, to volunteer, so that we can make this intervention, the paradigm for transformation, an incredible success. And we know you can do it with us.
Now, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I'm going to let you in on something. I'm a Black woman.
The system cannot fail those it was never designed to protect. And we're actually trying to educate young people in a system that inherently was never designed to serve all of them.
They know that when it comes to schooling, Black lives don't matter.
People don't care about our children. Our children are not a priority.
The American dream is not for young people of color.
This idea that if we all just work hard and put forth effort, we'll get our piece of the American dream is a farce.
You are a slave. You are not liberated. You are not free in your ideas, and you cannot even teach your children freely.
Pretty much you're being followed by a lynch mob. You're being followed by people who don't like you, who don't appreciate you, who only see you by skin color.
Treat that man like a person. That's not a kid.
That's a human.
That's a human being.
But why would we continue to allow our children to be less than what they are? Why would we continue to allow them to be in a system that does not teach them how to be creators? Teach them to be educators. Teach them to be artists.
Why do we fail to see the life and death implications of not educating every Black and brown student?
And I will say it again, knowledge has power.
The quality of your education is directly proportionate to your access to college, your access to jobs, your access to the future.
Education, I believe, is the most important thing to our uplift, because if we know nothing of self, if there is no knowledge of self, if there is no knowledge of the world, then there is nothingness.
Even to educate our children is a revolutionary act in America.
The time is now. There's no later time to do this kind of work. This is the seed planting time.
I can no longer. I can't wait all them years that I thought I was gonna wait to build an African school system. No, I can't wait. It's needed now. It's needed ASAP.
What is a carpenter with no tools? What is an actress with no stage? What is a scientist with no laboratory? What is a doctor with no equipment? I'll tell you, they're my kids. Shouldn't they be your kids too? I feel being a Black woman on campus sometimes, it's almost like it doesn't matter when slavery happened, because I still feel so othered.
When I would answer a question, you would get the little smirks like, oh, like she got it right. I was like one of like 3 or 4 Black students, and out of those Black students, I was like one of 2 Black girls. So I was able to get from about first grade really early on that people felt that I was unfit to be in their spaces.
I didn't feel like what I said in class was something of value.
At the end of the day, being a Black woman, and especially in a program such as this, I always feel like the need to like prove myself. Like I need to be the girl always in class. I need to be answering questions. I need to be getting them right, because I don't feel like I have room for error, because I already feel like there's so much coming up against me already.
So I was in a program, and it was for Model United Nations, and there was a new student that was leading it. So she wasn't familiar with who was there. I've been going to the program for 2 years at this point. And she asked me if I knew where I was. And I was like, well, I've been going to this program for 2 years and the room hasn't changed. So do you know where you are? Because at first I thought she was just like confused since she was new and I didn't recognize her. But by the time the lesson started, I recognized that she didn't think I belonged there, even though I was the first person in that program's history to even place at a competition.
Racism is so inefficient. So many people that are excellent people, talented people, don't get an opportunity to lead because the person in a position to make a decision can't see their talent because of their color, or can't see their talent because of their gender.
It still exists, we just don't talk about it, and we do have to talk about it. That's why I think something like this is so important, because it makes people so uncomfortable, because no one wants to be labeled a racist.
God created the races, and you are gonna be different. You can't help it
God
to be like that.
one race, the human race, and human beings created racism.
But until you have the conversation that there are some differences that make us all unique, and that it's okay, the differences are okay.
The phrase institutionalized racism. We talk about how these things are systemic, they are pervasive, and you don't even realize that they exist, that you're treating kids differently by some unconscious bias that you have. You have to talk about it. You have to point out the details and the data that they're scoring 33% less than the white students. That's a problem.
We have 8 million Black children walking into schools every day that aren't designed for them, were never made for them, and are not going to help them reach their highest potential.
We cannot be colorblind nor color mute. There used to be a time in this country when teachers could say, I treat all my kids the same. I don't see color. They're just all kids. But we cannot do that anymore. Our public school population is over 40% students of color, yet our teaching force is over 80% white. There is an inherent cultural mismatch, yet and still we believe that sameness produces equitable outcomes.
I've always noticed the racial makeup of my classes and how being in more advanced classes, like there are definitely more white students.
We've got a graduation rate in America of about 80-some-odd%, a modern day high. But the gap for Black students is about 14%. Kids who don't make it to graduation, they drop out. We've got about 50% of Black kids, I think, who are dropping out of high school.
I find that so many of our children come to school in kindergarten without the prerequisite literacy skills to make them successful. In the community where I'm from, Sacramento, California, Black students are the lowest performing subgroup outside of students with special needs.
Just like I need to demonstrate to myself first, and then definitely to these people who don't know anything about me, that I belong in this space just as much as anybody else.
Like, I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like I've earned the spots that I've been chosen to fill up. And it's not always like I'm here just to add a little bit more color.
Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? qual è buona?
Lei,
Perché è buona?
perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più?
The doll tests were a series of studies that Mamie Clark and Kenneth Clark did to try to determine racial awareness in young children, with the implication being that in a segregated society, if children are aware of race and the differences in race and the differences in how different racial groups are treated, that it would impact how they felt about themselves.
They showed black and white dolls who were otherwise identical to little children, little black children, and they asked who was the good doll, who was the bad doll, who was the pretty doll, who was the ugly doll, and the black children would invariably choose the white dolls as the better dolls and the black dolls as the inferior dolls, and then finally the bombshell question, which one looks like you?
When he got to that last question, give me the doll that looks like you, that's when the children would pause and be a bit more confused or looked troubled, because they had said in many cases, this is the bad doll, this is the nice doll. Remembering that they had said this is the bad doll, they now had to show the doll that looked like them. It was particularly difficult for them.
Many times tears would come to their eyes, and so this whole notion of the inferiority that segregation imbued in black school children was important, and the Supreme Court had some very eloquent language about that.
It was a fight Linda Brown's parents were determined to win. Their daughter at the center of the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case during a time when Jim Crow laws dominated the South. The Browns from Topeka, Kansas, along with other families, including Catherine Sawyer's, in a desperate battle to desegregate schools. 10-year-old Sawyer was the only child to testify. She wasn't allowed to attend the white school in her neighborhood. Instead, she took a long ride on a packed city bus to an overcrowded black school across town.
And we would be standing in the aisles sometimes. I think of all of us who could have had that same opportunity and didn't get it.
The Supreme Court ruled unanimously. Racial segregation in schools was no longer legal.
We do believe that this decision in itself will encourage the people.
Decided in 1954, Brown versus Board was a landmark case that opened the door for desegregation and the modern civil rights movement. In Brown, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools for white and black children, which had been prevalent throughout the American South since the 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson legalized segregation, were in fact inherently unequal, and ruled that segregated education constituted a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Brown was the case that cracked the edifice of Jim Crow segregation.
But it's not all better. Recently, segregation for black students has expanded in most of the country. The number of mostly black schools more than tripled between 1988 and 2016.
In 2016, GAO found that public schools have actually become more segregated by race in class than any time since 1960.
But I think if anybody looks at our public schools today and many of our communities and our towns and cities and our counties, we have to acknowledge, honestly, that there's still a great deal of segregation.
I also ask, how aware are we symbolically about how we create lines within our schools separating the us from the them?
Whether it's in the lunchroom or certain clubs or teams, like cheerleading, to see it up close and to sort of see the ways in which kids sort of segregate themselves was eye-opening.
Meet Central High School's class of 2014, 152 jubilant teenagers looking to the future but shaped by the past. There are families, friends, teachers. The only people missing, the white students who by law should have shared their classrooms.
Tiana Biggs.
But this is Alabama, and 60 years after segregation was ruled unlawful by the courts, resegregation is on the rise. Black schools for black students, separate but equal, just like the old days when George Wallace was governor.
Raise your hands if you think more should be done to integrate schools.
Most school districts, at least in the elementary years, assign students to schools based on neighborhood of residence. Segregated neighborhoods translate into segregated schools.
The 2011-2012 academic year data from the U.S. Department of Education shows that over 40% of black youth, that's about 3.2 million young people, attend high poverty schools.
I believe that we have witnessed the death of any meaningful efforts to desegregate our public schools. That's sad.
In the early 20th century in the US, you have this unprecedented accumulation of wealth in the hands of people like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller.
All of a sudden, you have no free labor, and they're kind of trying to figure out, how do we make sure that the South stays economically viable?
In this moment, you have people like Andrew Carnegie, and he said, I have this great option. It's called philanthropy.
Northern white captains of industry who all of a sudden want to go all in on educating newly freed rural black people.
They decide, really, that it has to be a manual arts training, something that is going to keep these folks subservient to white authority, but also keep them in the South. We have to keep them in the agricultural industry because otherwise our economy falls apart.
And it's getting massive amounts of money from Andrew Carnegie himself, from John D. Rockefeller, with the establishment of the GEB in 1903, which is Rockefeller funded.
Rockefeller created the General Education Board, which was an organization that created schools for black students.
Rockefeller decides, me and my friends should do this. Just a group of rich people and their friends go to the United States Congress and are like, hey, we're gonna pay for it. It won't cost you anything, but we wanna take over. Who's getting educated in what kinds of ways? And Congress goes, sure.
African Americans would learn the latest techniques in how to plow and how to milk a cow and how to pick cotton as if they hadn't been doing that for hundreds of years previously.
We've never had a moment where the country's been committed to educating poor kids and black kids in the same ways that we do wealthy white kids. It's always been a series of experiments for people who were poor. lucrative experiments, experiments that created wealth for businesses. The process of instituting public education in the United States starts off at its core as having been designed by philanthropists and business people and organized around Black inferiority. It was very controlling, and in that regard, it was all about a kind of white upper middle class standard.
It's a form of education that in no way will challenge your governance, and your governance is specifically white Anglo-Americans.
Education is one of our critical institutions. You were asking me earlier if I had to prioritize, if we were only going to work on one at a time. For me, education would be at the top because we need critical, analytical, knowledge-based thinkers to identify, see, and come up with potential interventions for a problem. And education, when it's done right, and not only from a Eurocentric perspective, creates a broad mind, a broad bandwidth, where we are growing individuals who are talented and who question, who analyze, who can see from a macro system perspective and even a micro system perspective. When we do it right, you have people coming to the table within organizations and institutions who are much more prepared in their brilliance to address key issues. We need people who reflect the world and not who just look like they reflect the world. It has to be a visual perspective and consciousness. I'm talking about conscious people who know who they are, where they come from, how we're connected, and they know history.
This is a map of the United States, and what it shows is relative school funding per child, so how much each locality spends each year per child. The orange and red areas are the areas that are spending less than the average. The turquoise to blue areas are spending more than the average, and I don't know if you can tell, but there's really only one state that you can pick out from even back there, and it's my home state of New York. That is the one state in the country, really, where, and they have other issues about education policy, but they are rocking school funding in New York. Not only are they at the top, they're at the top everywhere, and that's a big challenge. The United States, unlike every other developed nation, does not have one school system. We have a 50-state patchwork, and within each state, it's a patchwork, so that a child's zip code does, unfortunately, determine how well funded and supported that child's public education will be.
The reality is what we lack is the political will to publicly fund education. That's it.
If we want them to move up the proverbial ladders to college and university, they need the resources invested.
It's an education debt for all of the foregone schooling resources that were never invested in the education of the Black and brown child.
Public schools should receive more government funding. In many cases, states decide to attach that funding to performance.
It's very clear and it's very obvious. We need an equitable distribution of funding when it comes to schools. Schools that have more challenges should have more funding. What we have is the reverse.
The mold, the carpet, the walls itself, the classrooms, the teachers, everything that you need in the school or could use in the school is not there.
Students at Block High School in rural Louisiana say conditions at their school are so bad that they're struggling to get an education.
You got some the water that's been leaking, that's turning to mold. Like when you go in the classrooms, you can smell it.
That building there, B building, it is completely unsafe, but we still do go in there as far as using the auditorium.
These are the textbooks they were given at the beginning of the school year.
Kids have huge class sizes. The buildings are decrepit. The books that they use are from the 60s or the 70s.
Nearly 70% of seniors are Black, and about 60% of students here do not go on to college after graduation. But 13 miles away, there's another school in the same school district that looks a lot different.
There's a clear, notable difference in how the school looks compared to Block High School.
Nearly 90% of the senior class here is white. They perform better academically, and enroll in college at a higher rate.
Schools who have more challenges, have been historically low performing according to these metrics, get less and less and less funding, and in fact they're asked to compete with one another.
Public education, keeping poor kids poor since 1954.
In 1948, when my mom was about 10, in West Memphis, Arkansas, they were spending about $144 to educate a white child. You know how much they were spending to educate black children in the South? $19.50.
All this hand-wringing and confusion and ideas about moving money here or there honestly is a distraction from the fact that we have people who are benefiting from defunding public schools.
Do you support public education? $4 billion in cuts to investments in public schools, while proposing $1 billion in new funding for unauthorized programs, including to expand private school vouchers. This budget intends to shift public school funding and advance a radical agenda that transfers taxpayer dollars out of local community schools.
School funding should not be decided by property taxes or some funky economic equation where rich kids continue to benefit from state aid while poor kids are continuously having food and resources taken from their mouths.
For every 10 percentage point increase of students of color in a school, there is a decrease in per pupil spending of $75. Where we see more students of color in our schools, we tend to decrease the funding to educate them.
HBCUs are still critical engines for Black economic progress today, and they remain anchors of the ongoing movement for justice. But HBCUs are also facing an economic crisis. With small endowments, many of these institutions rely on federal funding to survive, which makes them vulnerable to the harsh currents of national politics.
We have a school funding gap in this country, much worse in high poverty areas, both urban and rural, and yet these are the very areas that the budget would starve. 90% of our kids are in public schools. We need more resources to help them succeed. You can't do more with less. You do less with less.
These policies ultimately don't just harm Black and brown and poor children, but also are going to harm all of America. To divest from public education is to shoot ourselves in the foot. It just doesn't make any sense.
The schoolhouse is such a profound vehicle for the community. It's really like running a little city. You feed people, you clothe people, you educate people, and if the kids are young enough, you change their pants, I mean, everything. It is an enterprise that brings the community together. It is a community gathering place. It is framing the childhood of our future leaders.
I think education is one of our critical institutions.
If we really, as a country, believe that education is the great equalizer, then it should be just that, equal.
Even given their flawed approach to integration, middle and high schools are some of the most desegregated spaces in this nation.
The more students feel that they belong in an educational context, the better they perform.
Research shows Black students from mixed schools were more likely to finish high school, to earn a degree, they made more money, and they were healthier.
But we can't lay all the blame on schools. If we are not willing to live together, play together, and educate our children together, how are schools supposed to move forward?
No one is going to care for our children as much as we care for our children. No one is going to make sure that they are the best selves that they can be. No one's going to talk about their character. No one's going to talk about their strength. No one's going to talk about their passions, their life outside of school. No one's going to talk about their culture. No one's going to do all of that but us. Because they are us. They are ours. They belong to us. That is our future.
It begins with inhabiting the same spaces, but it isn't accomplished until we achieve a true sense of community, one in which race doesn't imply hierarchy or value.
We have to help our economically challenged students make the critical connection between education and their future financial well-being.
This doesn't matter. Your color, your background, your size. People say, oh, they're going to listen to you because look at your size, they're scared of you. No. That's not how this is operating. It's what's coming from here.
Donate. Time, money, resources, opportunities, whatever whatever is in your heart.
Educators have to be committed to saying, I understand and recognize that I work in a system that is inherently unequal.
Change your frame and see people as part of your extended family. You don't have to like them all.
I'm going to make a committed effort to hire people who reflect our world. We're a global society.
Acknowledge the advantages that you have and use them to restore equity wherever you see bias. You are not powerless against institutional bias or unconscious bias. You have power to make a difference in this world.
There needs to be more talks focused on trying to stop the institutionalized racism.
I know that we can do better. I know that history tells us and informs us that we can make progress through our educational institutions, that we can all shift the tides of social and educational inequality if we provide ample resources and opportunities, if we cultivate culturally flexible minds, and if we come with empathic hearts.
Kids, you gotta accept who you are. You ain't gotta always worry about everybody's opinion. Worry about yourself. When you worry about yourself, then people gonna come because they see the real you. You are the future.
Don't be intimidated. The only person that can stop you is yourself.